Donald Trump is back in New York, where this afternoon he held a roundtable meeting on security and counterterrorism. He also received his first classified intelligence briefing. Now, this comes right after a rally in Wisconsin last night, near the site of the violent riots in Milwaukee over a fatal police shooting. Trump outlined his law and order vision for America.
I wear their opposition as a badge of honor, because it means I'm fighting for real change, not just partisan change where everybody else gets rich but you. I'm fighting, all of us across the country are fighting, for peaceful regime change in our own country. The media donor political complex that's bled this country dry has to be replaced with a new government of, by, and for the people.
In the wake of mayhem in Milwaukee, Trump also vowed to protect all Americans and reached out to African-American voters.
The main victims of these riots are law-abiding African-American citizens living in these neighborhoods. It's their job, it's their homes, it's their schools and communities which will suffer the most as a result. There's no compassion in tolerating lawless conduct. Crime and violence is an attack on the poor and will never be accepted in a Trump administration.
I got to go to you, Juan. What are your thoughts? Did Trump change your mind at all last night in Milwaukee?
No, I mean, I know Trump for what he is. I mean, Trump is speaking to white fears and anxiety and resentment, especially in the aftermath of the riots. So he didn't deliver that speech, for example, in Milwaukee. He goes 40 miles outside and speaks to a 95% white community, and then he starts speaking about the kind of misbehavior. Now, where he would have appealed to the black communities when he starts to say, hey, the Democrats, what have they done in Milwaukee? What have they done in other big cities? What about improving the schools? What about real policy change? Now, there I thought he might have something to say, but don't forget, Eric, this is the guy who was tweeting, oh, yeah, black people kill most white people in America. Sorry, that's not true. Here's the guy who said President Obama, he wasn't born here. He's a birther. You know, this is ridiculous. And it just, so he has no reservoir of good faith, not only in the black community, but in the Latino community.
Right. So, you wanted him to talk a little bit about economic policy, but this was built, KG, this was billed as the law and order speech that he was going to deliver.
I thought it was well executed, just like straight from like my college days of rhetoric and communications. You know, it was a very good speech, solid, well written, well delivered. I think he's getting more, you know, disciplined at trying to stay on message. So I think that's important to do, because you have to start now, you know, building roads to get others to try to get on board with your campaign, especially this close, you know, out to the general election. Days are slipping away very quickly. So I think that is good. Also, I also felt like he was trying to re-energize his base and also reestablish, take the mantle again as the outsider, while still focusing on the need to preserve law and order in America, and I think those are themes that everybody could, you know, agree with in that sense. So
what do you think, Greg? Had Trump gone into a largely African-American venue, would he be able to deliver the speech, or would he be interrupted in protests and whatnot?
That's why, in his defense, this is kind of a losing proposition. He's doing a speech in which he wants to persuade people who aren't listening to him, and he is speaking to people who already agree with him. So basically, this goes nowhere. He doesn't have to re-energize his base. His base is highly caffeinated. He needs to find new blood. So there's two things he can do. That speech was designed for cable shows to talk about how well it was. He should have spoke before the NAACP. However, we know what might happen. He will be heckled. He might be disrespected, but he will at least seem brave for doing that, and he might actually win the respect of other black leaders for saying, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to take my licks, and I don't care about it. He could do that, and I think he should still do that. The other thing, too, is he can repeat these things when he's on a debate stage, because there will be people come the debates that haven't seen him yet articulate this, who didn't tune into this because they don't like him, but maybe they'd be forced to see him and go, you know what? He's making some good points here. But in this particular case, it's a no-win situation. Whoever's listening already knows, and the people he wants to listen aren't interested.
Dana, your thoughts on did he lose by not putting the venue in the middle of where the riots were? I mean, I think Sheriff David Clark, who is in Milwaukee, right? I'm not mistaken about that.
Yeah.
Milwaukee. So I think he was okay with this.
Probably, but I think I agree with things that have been said so far. And one of the things he says is that Hillary Clinton is a bigot and that she is pandering to the black community, but she gets a 91% approval rating with African Americans, and I don't know if you can say she's pandering. Now, I agree that liberal policies in a lot of municipalities in particular, especially on education and schools, have been a huge problem. And here he is again in Wisconsin. Just 2 weeks ago, was it, or was it last week, where he had to, remember he read the endorsement of Paul Ryan, who won his race by 66%. Yeah. He's in Wisconsin. Paul Ryan arguably has the best anti-poverty inner-city policy changes that he's already teed up. That was one of the things that Trump and Ryan first talked about and could agree upon, that Trump would try to advance those policy agendas. He had a whole plethora of things that he could have talked about and said it was the Democrats in the Senate who kept blocking these proposals that could have helped your communities. So if you're talking to that community last night, and that's your audience and they agree with you, but you might have skeptical Republicans that are sort of looking for a way to see how are you going to unite the party, he missed an opportunity to do that.
Sure. And you mentioned that bigot comment. I think we have a little piece of sound of that.
We reject the bigotry of Hillary Clinton, which panders to and talks down to communities of color and sees them only as votes. That's all they care about, not as individual human beings worthy of a better future. She doesn't care at all about the hurting people of this country or the suffering she has caused them, and she, meaning she and her party officials. The African-American community has been taken for granted for decades by the Democratic Party, and look how they're doing.
All right, Greg, you'll take it?
Well, I mean, it's a fair point. Yeah. I mean, and Juan, you agree that because they vote dedicatedly to the Democrats don't have to do much. But the point is, assigning blame is important if you aren't interested in actually winning more people. At this point, you have to unify, and you have to be better. You have to take the high road. Even if Hillary calls you a bigot, you have to say, whatever, this is not about assigning blame. I want to actually talk to people about this, and these are real problems, and talk about specifically how the Democratic Party has harmed the black community, which you brought up earlier. But I'm not sure assigning blame at this point is helpful, especially to an audience that agrees with you.
Right. So, but I just wanted to say, picking up on what Greg was talking about, I think it's totally legitimate to say Democrats take black votes for granted in terms of saying, here are the real results of our policies and how we've improved the quality of your life. On the other hand, Republicans ignore the black vote, and I would say, you know, after 12, you saw efforts by the RNC, the Republican National Committee, in fact, to say we're going to put more money, time, effort into reaching out not only to blacks, but to Latinos, to women, to young people that are now fleeing Trump. But instead, what Trump has done is he has pulled away, because he has gone back to what you, Greg, was describing as his base, that angry white male voter. And he has said, I'm doubling down. And I think later in the next segment, we're going to talk about how he's doubling down in terms of the people he's bringing on staff. You don't see him bringing on staff people who are really about outreach to the black community, much less the Latino community. And Paul Ryan, my God, remember, Paul Ryan's the guy who said his behavior or views of that judge who's Hispanic was the definition of racism.
Okay, but again, let's stay on topic here. Dana points out and Juan points out that there are economic policies that may better make his case, KG, with the black community. However, again, a law enforcement, law and order speech, and that's where you focused on.
Right, well, that's the focus. And the point is, yeah, I think policy speeches are good to be delivered in a clear, coherent way, to have some specifics, to make people decide whether or not they want to choose him based on his ideas that he's generated and that he's communicating. So if you have a law and order speech, to focus on that. There's another speech can focus on the economy, jobs, all of that. That's a strong suit for him. We saw that in a lot of the exit polling that was coming out on, you know, primaries, et cetera, that people were really caring about that, because at the end of the day, people do want to make sure that they can put gas in the car, food on the table, you know, send their kids to school with clothes on their back, and all of the above. So that's what he has to do. I mean, don't get drawn into the personal tax stuff and whatnot. I don't like talking about, you know, that Hillary Clinton, et cetera. She sort of got that 91% shored up. Like, go where you can get some, and that's independence and try and do better as well with women.
Dana, can I build on something that Greg said? If you really want to get the vote, then you should go after the vote, and go after the vote full frontal force right in the middle of the vote. If he's never going to get the vote anyway, isn't that enough of an outreach saying, hey, look, I recognize it, I want your vote, I'm asking for your vote, but should he go that extra yard?
So he's got 83 days left until the election.
Wow.
And so, and early voting starts in about 4 weeks. So I can see that point. I do think that one thing that he could do, all of these problems are made easier to solve if there's more economic growth.
Yes.
And he does well on those questions in polls. That's one of the places that he does really well. What he might be able to do is to say to them, I understand that you're likely to vote black community. I understand that you are likely to vote for Hillary Clinton. Fine. But I just ask you, challenge her. Challenge her how she's going to change things. How is she going to get your kids back to work? And really try to drive home on the economic growth message. Because if he wants to be president, it's not just that you have to win on November 8th. It's that you have to lead this nation for the next 4 years, and then hopefully you would run for re-election.
Can I jump in here, Dan? I'm sorry, I want to get this last piece of sound and let you, you react to that. Trump also blasts Clinton for not supporting law enforcement. Watch.
Just like Hillary Clinton is against the minors, she is against the police, believe me. Those peddling the narrative of cops as a racist force in our society, a narrative supported with a nod by my opponent, shared directly in the responsibility for the unrest in Milwaukee and many other places within our country. They have fostered the dangerous anti-police atmosphere in America.
It's kind of a common belief. Is he accurate?
Is he asking me?
Yep.
If she's accurate?
If Donald Trump is accurate saying that the Democrats have fostered this kind of mistrust
well, remember,
with the police.
I understand why they're making that argument, but remember early on when she was having at one of her primary events, Black Lives Matter, remember they came in, they interrupted her, they interrupted Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
And they were actually thinking that she hadn't done enough for the black community. She, of late, has tried to balance a little bit more, but there is the case of whether or not she's going to go for the police union's endorsement, and I don't know if she will or not. Maybe she already has made that decision, but I don't know if it's fair to say that she's against the police. She didn't say she wanted to put the police out of business. She did say she wants to put the minors out of business.
But I will say this about this. Look, so he has a point. Let's talk about economic policies. Let's talk about schools. I think Donald Trump has a strong point to make, and especially about Democrats taking black voters for granted and black voters not doing enough to push back. But when he comes to this idea that somehow she is peddling a narrative of racist cops as if it's a fantasy, as if it's just should get those silly black people to vote for her. Well, that essentially what he's doing is undercutting, ignoring, deriding legitimate arguments about excessive use of force by police against black people. And again, so you can make a point about what happened in Ferguson, there was no hands up and all the rest, but you can't ignore that the Justice Department that also said there was no hands up also says, hey, that Ferguson Police Department full of racist behavior and attitudes. Same thing in Baltimore, same thing in Chicago.
Trump was talking about Hillary Clinton and the Democrats. Now, if you look at the two different, we attended both conventions. There was clearly a more open-armed embrace of law enforcement with Republicans than the Democrats.
Well, not just that. The police, from our experience, the police are way more on the side of a Republican than a Democrat, just because they feel that they're not being supported by the Democratic Party. And go ahead.
And I just wanted to make note that one of the first speakers or groups of speakers at the DNC was the mothers of Trayvon Martin, of Michael Brown, of Eric Garner, family members. And law enforcement wasn't represented at that time.
Yeah, so the problem is, yeah, many in law enforcement felt that, and feel, by the way, in this country right now with the mood, that they aren't being respected or, appreciated, or they have targets on their back. So that's also, I think, one, like an issue that needs to be addressed as well, that should also be, given measure.
I couldn't agree more. I think you got to respect law enforcement. I do think that if we're talking about the politics, Kimberly, when you are talking to black people in this country, they will tell you they have a difficult relationship, regardless of class, with the police. And so if you're talking to politicians, you appreciate a politician who says, well, wait a second, we love cops, but we don't appreciate the idea that people, especially for their children, live in fear of what happens when the policeman stops their
They
child.
live in more fear of the criminal than they do the cop, and the media has reversed that that recipe, and it's now like, oh, they've exaggerated, they've taken isolated cases and made them into a phenomenon. Having said that, a person can address that issue, but they always have to add in but. You know, they have to say, well, this is a terrible thing, but law enforcement this, or you can say, law enforcement is great, but. So there has to be this balance at all.
There's always an equivocation.
Yes.
I have to butt in.